much lighter in British America than in Spanish America, but the parliamentary nature of British monarchy, sanctified, of course, by the glorious Revolution of 1688, was reflected in the existence of colonial parliamentary assemblies of a kind which didn't exist in Spanish America. So that then, I think, is one major difference in the two empires, the dates of founding. Secondly, of course, they were very different in scale and size of population and racial composition. Mainland Spanish America had a surface area of over 5 million square miles. British America had a surface area of about 322,000. The population of Spanish America at the time of independence was something of the order of 15 to 16 million. That of British America was 2,200,000 whites and perhaps 750,000 blacks. So it was 3 million most. And the colonial societies, too, were very different, of course, in ethnic composition. Spain's American territories, and many of them densely settled by indigenous peoples at the time of the arrival of the Spaniards, consisted of white Creole elites sitting on the top of racially mixed societies, which generally consisted of large Indian populations, increasingly large populations of mixed race, mestizos, and a great many free or enslaved blacks. And although the British colonies contained submerged Indian populations, the Indian component was not very numerous. Many of the Indians had been pushed beyond the colonial borders and into the American interior as the British colonies advanced their borders. Unlike the Spanish territories, the British colonies were not racially mixed. Instead, they consisted of white elites, not all of which were of British origin. There were a great many Germans, for instance, arrived in Pennsylvania in the 18th century, and to a greater or lesser degree, an African population, a majority of slaves. So that then is a second major difference in size, scale, and the composition of the populations. I think a third difference was that Spanish-American society was much more urbanized than that of British America. And Spain's American territories contained some very large cities indeed. For instance, in the 18th century, Mexico City had 112,000 inhabitants, whereas the largest city in British America, Boston, had 16,000 roughly. And the economy of an urbanized Spanish America revolves around the production of silver from the enormously rich mines of the viceroyalties of New Spain, which is the name the Spaniards gave to Mexico, and Peru. By contrast, the economy of a largely agrarian British America revolved primarily around agricultural production, either for home consumption or, as with the southern colonies and the Caribbean islands, for export, especially of tobacco, and in the islands, particularly Barbados and Jamaica, of sugar. Both of them, of course, crops grown on plantations worked by slaves. And the fourth major difference which I pick out is the religious composition of the two empires. Again, extremely different. Spanish America was religiously uniform in the sense that Roman Catholicism was its exclusive religion, although one has to remember the Roman Church was very far from being monolithic. Different religious orders often competing with each other, for instance. The Spanish-American societies rested on a very close alliance over the centuries between church and state. Education was dominated by the church and religious orders, and the Inquisition tried, although not, I think, very effectively by the 18th century, to prevent the import of prohibited and heretical books. British America, by contrast, was religiously pluralist. There's no dominant and exclusive faith. There's not a single Anglican bishop in America before the Declaration of Independence, and a multitude of religions competed in the marketplace for adherence. Unlike Spanish America, this was a religiously open world. Well, I think that those major differences, which I very briefly identified in the character of the two empires, inevitably played themselves out in the character and the trajectory of the independence movement in ways that I hope will become clear as our discussion develops. But if the differences are great, did the independence movements really have anything in common? And is is our attempt at comparison with the effort? Well, in two respects at least, they shared something of the same background. First of all, they took place in an Atlantic community that was really being swept by the bracing winds of the European Enlightenment. On both sides of the Atlantic, there were calls for the application of reason, of science, and technology to human affairs in order to improve the lot of the human race. And the effect of this was to undermine traditional fatalist attitudes about the nature of life, the nature of the universe, and replace them with a growing belief in the possibility of progress. And that sentiment is spreading into the New World in the middle and later years of the 18th century. And secondly, this was a world too in which conflicts in the international state system of Europe were being extended across the globe and evolving into a real conflict of empires in the course of the 18th century. And the British and Spanish empires confronted each other in the 7 Years' War of 1756 to 63. And at least in my view, the 7 Years' War marks a starting point for the subsequent independent movements in both empires. The cost of war and imperial defense rose dramatically during the course of that conflict, and you find London and Madrid reacting in similar ways. Both those governments in London and Madrid now sought to raise more money from their American territories to meet the increasing costs of empire. And in order to raise that money, they both embarked in the aftermath of the 7 Years' War, after 1763 in particular, on programs of reform which seemed to conform to the rational principles of enlightened government, but which provoked violent opposition as the reform programs began to be implemented. In North America, the protests of the colonial populations against the government's new tax measures, like the Stamp Act and the Townshend duties, culminated, of course, in the Declaration of Independence of 1776. In Spanish America, as I'm sure we'll be hearing more detail from Tony McFarlane, the Bourbon Reform Program led in the late 1770s and early 1780s to major rebellions in Peru and Nueva Granada, which is the modern-day Colombia. And these Spanish-American rebellions, unlike those of North America, British North America, were successfully contained. And it was going to take another 30 years on the collapse of imperial government following Napoleon's invasion and occupation of Spain in 1880 for Spanish Americans to achieve the independence that British Americans had achieved a whole generation earlier. But I think that from the early 70s, in British and Spanish America alike, the stage had been set for the convulsive upheavals that would shake the two American empires to their foundation and would end with the emancipation of the colonial societies from their mother country.